Okay, so when you think about the age of European empires, the figure of the Christian missionary almost always pops up. But the story we're told is usually one of two extremes, right? Were they saints and heroes, or were they just agents of colonialism in religious clothing? Well, the truth is, it's way more complicated than that. So let's dive in and really unpack this relationship between missions and empire.
This is the big question, isn't it? The one that's framed this whole debate for years. And for a long time, the answer seemed like a simple yes. But as we're about to see, the reality on the ground, well, it was a tangled web of conflict, strange alliances, and a whole lot of unintended consequences.
For a good chunk of the 20th century, there was one dominant story that historians told. And that story was pretty clear. Missionaries were basically the cultural and spiritual wing of European colonialism. This view saw the entire missionary project as being totally intertwined with the goals of empire.
Academics even gave it a name: cultural imperialism. The idea here is that Western powers didn't just use armies and money to build their empires. They used culture. And missionaries, whose whole job was religious conversion and social change, were seen as the perfect tool for the job.
And this quote, wow, it just perfectly sums up that entire school of thought. The argument was that missions gave a kind of moral justification for what was often a really brutal process of conquest. It reframed the whole thing not as simple domination, but as a noble, civilizing mission. So this colonialism paradigm, as it was called, really boiled down to a few key arguments. The first was that missionaries weren't just innocent bystanders. They're actively working with colonial governments. The second, that the real goal was to replace indigenous ways of thinking with a Western one, to colonize the consciousness. And finally, that they helped build the very systems that allowed colonial exploitation to happen.
Okay, but that's the standard story. And like with a lot of standard stories, historians eventually started to poke holes in it. They began to argue that while, yeah, the connections were there, the reality on the ground was way more complex, full of contradictions, and honestly, a lot of conflict.
And you can really see the friction here. On one side, you have the missionaries showing up with these big, idealistic visions. They wanted to evangelize, sure, but they also wanted to build schools, open hospitals, and in many cases, fight the slave trade. But then they ran headfirst into the colonial reality. They often faced opposition from the very colonists they were supposedly helping. Why? Because trading companies and colonial officials saw them as troublemakers who were bad for business.
And we have really concrete examples of this. I mean, in India, the British East India Company, the biggest colonial power there, actually banned missionary work for years because they were afraid it would stir up unrest and hurt their profits. And in Africa, you had missionaries on the ground sometimes decades before any formal colonial government was established. So that idea of them all being on the same team, it just falls apart when you look at the facts.
In fact, what's really fascinating is that one of the most influential missionary ideas of the 19th century was actually the total opposite of permanent colonial control. It was a vision for creating something that could stand completely on its own.
This came from a guy named Henry Venn, a leader in a big British missionary society, and he came up with this three-self theory. The idea was revolutionary for its time. The goal wasn't to build a bunch of outposts run by Europeans forever. It was to plant local, indigenous churches that would be completely independent, governing themselves, paying for themselves, and spreading the faith themselves.
So the whole point, the end game, was to make themselves obsolete. The stated goal was what they called the euthanasia of the mission. A point where the foreign missionaries could pack up and go home because a strong local church was running the show. That is the complete opposite of a blueprint for permanent foreign rule. But this beautiful visionary ideal crashed right into the ugly realities of empire and racism. As more white settlers moved to places like New Zealand and South Africa, they just flat out refused to be part of a church led by a non-white bishop. The incredible Samuel Ajay Crowther, who was the first African Anglican bishop, even had to deal with younger white missionaries under him who refused to accept his authority. It's unbelievable. And under that pressure, that independent three-self idea was often tossed aside for a permanent trustee model, where Europeans would stay in charge forever.
And this brings us to what might be the most crucial part of this whole story, the part that the old view completely ignored. And that is the active, decisive role played by the local people themselves. They were not just passive victims waiting for history to happen to them.
Historian Lamin Sanneh puts it perfectly. He basically says that when we only focus on what the Westerners were doing, we're stealing the story from the people who actually lived it. We're silencing them and acting like they couldn't think or choose for themselves.
And when you actually look at who is converting, the story gets so much more interesting.
Take that pioneer missionary in Bengal, William Carey. He thought he'd be converting the poorest of the poor, but guess who actually became the first converts? Literate, middle-caste people who were already part of their own spiritual movements and saw something in this new faith that connected with their own journey.
Or look at China. It's an amazing story. European priests were kicked out of the country for decades. When they finally got back in, they didn't find a religion in ruins. They found a thriving, underground Catholic church that had survived and grown for generations, all run by local Chinese leaders, men and women, with zero foreign help.
And maybe the biggest irony of all happened in West Africa. The very education that missionaries provided, teaching about rights, democracy, and nationhood, became the weapon that a new generation of African leaders used to fight back against colonialism. The mission schools ended up training the future leaders of independent nations. So you see, it wasn't a one-way street at all. We're talking about active players here. Local leaders often invited missionaries in because they wanted access to schools and modern medicine. They weren't just copy-pasting a foreign religion. They were translating it, shaping it to fit their own world. And get this, the people who really spread Christianity across Africa and Asia? It wasn't the handful of Europeans. It was thousands of local, indigenous evangelists. So, how in the world do we put all these contradictory pieces together? Well, the source material we're looking at today offers a new framework, not as a one-way street of domination, but as a dynamic, messy, two-way street. And this is the core idea, converting colonialism. This phrase describes the constant struggle by both missionaries and local Christians to deal with the colonial system they were stuck in. It was an effort to use parts of it for their own benefit, to challenge its worst injustices, and to try and change it from the inside. It wasn't a simple alliance. It was a constant, pragmatic negotiation.
And this is so important. The pressure went both ways. The sheer power of the colonial system was immense, and it was always pushing back. Those idealistic missionary visions, they were constantly being compromised, bent out of shape, or, as the text puts it, beaten down on the anvil of pragmatic accommodation. Idealism met the harsh reality of colonial power, and a lot of the time, reality won.
So, what's the bottom line here? Let's boil it down. First, the link between missions and empire wasn't a simple alliance. It was messy, complex, and full of contradictions. Second, we can't see missionaries as just heroes or villains. They were pragmatic people, caught between their big ideas and the powerful forces on the ground. And third, and maybe most importantly, the key to the whole story is indigenous agency. Local people took this new faith and made it their own, for their own reasons and on their own terms.
This whole story is a powerful reminder, isn't it? It shows how even the biggest plans and the most idealistic visions can be twisted and transformed by the reality on the ground, and by the choices that ordinary people make. History is so often a story of unintended consequences, and that really leaves us with a big question to think about. What does that mean for the changes we're trying to make in the world today?